A wealthy man heartlessly left his wife and their child to chase after his lover. Fast forward 23 years, and he found himself frozen with shock when he saw her at a high-end hotel, accompanied by a young man who looked just like him. James stood at the window of his upscale penthouse, the sparkling New York skyline stretched out before him. The weight of his decision pressed on him, but he shoved it aside. This wasn't about guilt or second-guessing. No, this was about pursuing a better life, a life full of luxury, thrill, and the kind of indulgence he believed he deserved. His wife, Laura, had grown distant, consumed by their quiet life on the farm. She wasn't the vibrant woman he had once married. Then there was Jack, the little boy, always asking innocent questions with those wide, curious eyes. James wasn't up for the responsibility anymore. His gaze shifted to Vanessa, lounging on the sleek leather couch. She was everything Laura wasn't: glamorous, lively, and spontaneous. Vanessa didn't waste time talking about boring things like crops or weather. She wanted to travel to exotic locations, sip champagne on yachts, and attend elite parties. She represented freedom, wrapped in designer silk. "I can't keep pretending," James muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "You don't have to," Vanessa replied, her voice smooth and filled with confidence. "Laura is holding you back. You've outgrown that life, James. It's time to move on." Her words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were the truth. For years, James had tried to convince himself that his marriage could improve, that he could revive whatever connection he once had with Laura. But deep down, he knew things had changed. He had changed. The farm life didn't appeal to him anymore, nor did the quiet simplicity of family dinners or the duties of being a father. James turned away from the window and grabbed the suitcase from the corner of the room. It was already packed, a silent admission of his decision. No more delays, no more hesitation. He had booked a flight to Los Angeles for the next morning, where Vanessa had connections that could transform everything. They would start anew, far from the farm, from Laura, and from Jack. As James zipped up the suitcase, a wave of unease passed over him. He briefly pictured Laura standing on the porch of their farmhouse, watching as his car disappeared down the road. He imagined Jack chasing after the car, calling for him. His chest tightened, but he quickly pushed the thought away. "This is for the best," he told himself. "I can't live that life anymore." Vanessa got up from the couch, sliding her hand over his shoulder. "Don't look back, James. You're doing the right thing." He nodded, though the knot in his stomach remained. The truth was, he hadn't even told Laura. There had been no confrontation, no argument. He had just stopped answering her calls, stopped visiting. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't naive. But she didn't know he had already made up his mind. James knew Laura was too proud to beg him to stay. But deep down, he also knew this would break her heart. He could picture her sitting by the old piano in their living room, her fingers hovering over the keys, unsure whether to play the sad song she always played when things weren't right. It had been years since she performed. The passion they once shared had faded long ago. Now, her life revolved around surviving on that lonely farm. Vanessa's hand tightened on his shoulder, pulling him from his thoughts. "You've got a flight to catch." Without another word, James grabbed the suitcase, the final action that cut him off from his past. He wasn't going to be the man stuck in a rural life, weighed down by chores and obligations. No more feeding chickens, no more tending crops, no more dull conversations about the weather. He glanced at Vanessa one last time before heading out the door. Her smile was bright, full of promise, but it didn't hold the warmth that Laura's once did. Still, this was easier. Vanessa didn't expect more from him than he was willing to give, and that was enough. Outside, the city lights reflected off the windshield, as he drove through the bustling streets, leaving behind the quiet life Laura and Jack still held on to. The farm was hundreds of miles away, but he could already feel the emotional distance growing. He imagined the moment Laura would realize he wasn't coming back, her world crumbling with no explanation. But that wasn't his concern anymore. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. Laura stood on the porch of their farmhouse, her eyes lost in the distance where the sky met the rolling fields. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the land. But she barely noticed. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by the silence that had become all too common in recent months. The phone calls from James had stopped weeks ago, and no matter how much she tried to reach him, there was no response. She knew something was wrong, but she wasn't prepared for the reality she was about to face. The door creaked open, and Jack stepped out, holding a small toy truck in his hand. "Mama, when's Daddy coming home?" he asked, looking up at her with wide, hopeful eyes. Laura's heart clenched. She knelt down and gently brushed his hair back. "I don't know, sweetie," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "But we're going to be okay, I promise." She wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. Each day that passed without word from James felt like another step deeper into a truth she didn't want to accept. It had been obvious for a while that their marriage wasn't what it used to be. Still, Laura had held on to the hope that they could somehow find their way back to each other. She had sacrificed so much for James, her career, her dream of becoming a renowned pianist. She had traded the spotlight for a quiet life in the country, raising their son and running the farm, while James focused on his business pursuits. But now, the silence between them was overwhelming. Laura stood up, took a deep breath, and forced herself to take in her surroundings. The farm was calm, except for the soft rustling of the leaves in the evening breeze. It had once been a place of serenity, but recently, it felt more like a cage. The responsibilities weighed heavily on her, bills piling up, the endless upkeep, and the constant anxiety about how she would manage everything on her own. If James wasn't coming back, how were they going to make it? As she headed inside, Jack walked close behind, tugging at her sleeve. "Can we have pancakes for dinner?" he asked. Laura gave a small, tired smile. "Sure. Pancakes sound perfect," she said, trying to sound upbeat. Jack deserved more than the sadness she was holding on to. He was just a little boy, and she had to protect him from the truth for as long as possible. The kitchen was small but cozy, filled with reminders of the life they had once built together. Laura pulled out the ingredients for pancakes, her thoughts drifting as she measured the flour and cracked the eggs. She thought back to the early days when she and James had first moved to the farm. They had been so excited, eager to start a family and build something meaningful. The farm had been their shared dream. James used to talk about raising their kids surrounded by nature, far from the hustle of city life. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Laura shook her head, pushing those memories aside. Dwelling on the past wouldn't change anything now. She had to focus on the present, on making sure Jack was fed and happy. That was her only priority now. As they sat down to eat, Laura forced herself to keep the conversation light, asking Jack about his day and listening as he excitedly talked about the toy cars he had been playing with. He was so full of life, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside his mother. Laura envied his innocence, his unshaken belief that everything would turn out fine. But as night fell and Jack drifted off to sleep, Laura found herself alone again with her thoughts. She sat by the window, gazing out at the moonlit fields. The farm was so quiet, and in that stillness, the truth slowly sank in. James wasn't coming back. She hadn't heard anything official, but deep down, she knew it was over. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time since James had disappeared, she let herself cry. She had been strong for Jack, holding everything together. But now, alone in the silence of the night, she allowed the weight of it all to break her. The man she had once loved, the father of her child, had abandoned them. The life they had built together was nothing more than a memory now, and she was left to pick up the pieces alone. After what felt like hours, Laura wiped her eyes and stood. There was no use in sitting in her sorrow. She had a son to raise, a farm to run. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Slowly, she began to brace herself for the hard road ahead. Tomorrow, she would have to figure out how to keep the farm going. Tomorrow, she would have to find a way to provide for Jack. Tomorrow, she would have to learn how to be both mother and father. It wouldn't be easy, but she didn't have a choice. She had to keep going. As the early morning sun cast long shadows across the fields, Laura struggled to lift a heavy sack of feed toward the barn. Her muscles burned from the strain, her body unaccustomed to the kind of physical labor the farm demanded. The isolation of it all pressed down on her, but she refused to give in. Jack was still fast asleep inside the house, and the last thing Laura wanted was for him to see her struggling. She needed him to feel secure, to believe that everything was under control, even when it wasn't. As she reached the barn door, the sound of a truck rolling down the dirt road caught her attention. It was rare to hear that sound out here. Visitors were uncommon in this secluded part of the countryside. Laura turned, wiping the sweat from her brow, and watched as an old, beat-up pickup truck came to a stop near the house. Out stepped a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, his skin tanned by the sun, with a calm, steady expression. His hat was worn from use, his boots were covered in dirt, and his jeans had clearly seen better days. Laura immediately felt her guard go up. Strangers didn't come around much, especially not since James had left. As the man approached, he tipped his hat respectfully. "Morning, ma'am," he said in a deep, steady voice. "Name's David. I live a few miles down the road. Heard you might need a hand around here." Laura hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't someone who accepted charity easily, and the thought of letting a stranger into her life made her uncomfortable. But the truth was undeniable. She did need help. The farm was too much for one person, and with James gone, there was no one else to turn to. I don't think we need any help," she replied, her voice wavering just a little. "But thanks for the offer." David didn't move. He stood there with a kind yet unwavering look in his eyes. "I've seen you working the fields," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's a tough job for anyone, especially for someone doing it all alone. I've been farming all my life. I know how it is." Laura bit her lip, glancing down at the heavy sack of feed she had just dropped. The exhaustion was creeping in, and as much as she hated to admit it, she was struggling. Laura was exhausted, really exhausted, and the thought of having some help, even just for a little while, was tempting. But trust didn't come easily to her, especially not with strangers. Still, there was something about David's demeanor that put her at ease. He didn't look at her with pity or judgment, just an honest willingness to help. "I guess I could use some help with the heavier work," she finally admitted, swallowing her pride just a little. David nodded, a faint, reassuring smile crossing his lips. "I'm not here to get in your way, ma'am. Just thought I could make things a little easier for you." Laura sighed and gestured toward the barn. "Well, if you're offering, I could use a hand moving that sack of feed inside." Without a word, David rolled up his sleeves and went to work. He lifted the heavy sack effortlessly, carrying it into the barn with ease. Laura watched him, her earlier skepticism starting to melt away. He wasn't just offering help, he was more than capable, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, she felt a bit of the weight on her shoulders lift. As the morning wore on, David continued helping around the farm. He fixed a broken fence, organized the clutter in the barn, and even managed to get the old tractor up and running again. Laura couldn't believe how much they had accomplished in just a few hours. For the first time in a long time, a small spark of hope flickered inside her. At lunchtime, they sat around the small wooden table in the house. Jack, now awake and full of energy, chatted excitedly about his toy trucks, while Laura served sandwiches. David listened patiently, nodding and smiling as Jack rambled on. Laura noticed how naturally David fit into their home, how comfortable he seemed around her son. "You've been a big help today," Laura said as they ate, breaking the quiet that had settled over the room. "I don't know how I would have managed without you." David shrugged modestly. "Just glad I could help. I've been in your shoes before. I lost my wife a few years back. Things were tough for quite a while. I know what it's like to try to carry the weight of the world all on your shoulders." Laura lowered her eyes to her plate, feeling a pang of empathy for this man she hardly knew. She could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just saying those words to be nice. He had lived through his own hardships, just like she was now. Maybe that's why he had come by today. Perhaps he understood her struggle more than she realized. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly, looking up to meet his gaze. "It's hard, doing all this alone." David gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "It doesn't have to be that way, Laura. Sometimes it's okay to let people in. You don't have to do it all by yourself." His words struck a deep chord within her. For so long she had tried to be strong, to hold everything together for Jack. But maybe David was right. Maybe she didn't need to carry this burden alone anymore. As the afternoon stretched on, Laura found herself opening up to David more and more, sharing little pieces of her life on the farm, her love for music, and the dreams she once had of becoming a concert pianist. David listened without interrupting, and by the time he left that evening, Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. His unexpected visit may have been just what she needed. The days following David's arrival passed in a blur of hard work, but for the first time in ages, Laura didn't feel like she was barely holding on. With David's help, the farm began to run more smoothly. The fences were repaired, the crops were tended, and the heavy weight that had been crushing Laura's spirit seemed to lighten, if only a little. Jack, too, had grown fond of David. He followed him around like a little shadow, constantly asking questions about tractors, animals, and anything else that captured his curiosity. One afternoon, after finishing the day's chores, Laura found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the trees. The air was cool and refreshing, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a calm wash over her. David had returned to his own farm for the evening, leaving Laura with a rare moment of peace. Inside the house, Jack was busy with his toy trucks, his cheerful chatter echoing through the room. Laura leaned back, closing her eyes and allowing the quietness of the moment to sink in. Her mind wandered, almost without her realizing it, to the piano that had sat untouched for years. There it was, in the corner of the living room, gathering dust, the same piano that had once been at the center of her world. It was the instrument that had carried her through her teenage years, through college, and through the early days of her marriage. Back then, music had been everything to her. She used to spend countless hours practicing, dreaming of performing on grand stages in front of captivated audiences. But those dreams had faded once she married James, and they disappeared completely when they moved to the farm. The piano became a relic of a life she no longer recognized, a symbol of everything she had left behind. She hadn't dared touch it, as if playing it would reopen the wounds of those lost dreams. Laura stood up and quietly walked back inside the house. Jack barely noticed as she passed him, his focus still on his trucks, as she made her way to the corner where the piano stood waiting. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the well-worn keys. Could she really do this? Could she reconnect with that part of herself she had buried so long ago? Taking a deep breath, she pressed her fingers to the keys. The sound that emerged was soft at first, hesitant, but it awakened something deep within her. The melody she had memorized years ago slowly resurfaced, as though her hands remembered what her mind had forgotten. The notes poured out, filling the house with music that hadn't been heard in so long. As she played, memories of her old life flooded back, before the farm, before James, before all of it. There had been so much hope, so much passion in those days. And though her life had taken a different path, playing again felt like reclaiming a lost part of herself. Jack wandered into the living room, still holding his toy truck, and stood silently by her side, wide-eyed and amazed as he watched his mother bring the music back to life. Laura glanced at Jack, a soft smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of joy. "Wow, Mama," Jack whispered in awe, his eyes wide. "You're really good." Laura chuckled, her fingers continuing to glide over the keys. "I used to play a lot when I was younger," she said. "It's been a long time." "Why did you stop?" Jack asked, his innocent question lingering in the air. Laura's smile faltered briefly. There were so many reasons: James, the move, the demands of family life. But she couldn't explain all that to a child. "I guess life got busy," she replied gently. "But maybe it's time I start again." In the days that followed, Laura made it a habit to sit at the piano more often, sometimes playing late into the night after Jack had gone to bed. The more she played, the more her old love for music returned. The melodies soothed her, making her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. One evening, while Laura was lost in the music, David knocked on the door. Jack, excited as always to see him, ran to let him in. David stepped inside, and his eyes immediately found Laura at the piano. "I didn't know you played," David said, leaning against the doorframe. Laura paused, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I used to," she replied with a shy smile. "I'm just getting back into it." David grinned. "You're really good, you know." Laura blushed, unused to compliments, especially about her playing. "Thanks," she muttered, her fingers lightly resting on the keys. "You ever think about playing for others again?" David asked casually. Laura laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, I don't know. I think those days are behind me." "Why?" David asked, his tone genuine. "You've got talent, Laura. People should hear you." The idea of performing had crossed her mind, but it seemed so far away, almost unrealistic. There were so many responsibilities now: the farm, bills, raising Jack. The life where music was her focus felt like a distant memory. But as Laura sat there, her fingers lightly tracing the smooth ivory keys, she realized that maybe it wasn't as impossible as she had thought. "I'll think about it," she said quietly, not wanting to make any promises, but feeling a small glimmer of hope nonetheless. David nodded, understanding it wasn't something she could decide in a moment. Still, the seed had been planted. Laura felt it too, a tiny spark of ambition that had been buried for far too long. As the evening stretched on, David stayed a while longer, helping Jack with his homework and chatting with Laura about the daily farm work. But even after David left, the thought of the piano and what it meant for her future lingered. That night, after Jack went to bed, Laura found herself back at the piano, this time allowing the music to flow freely. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for her future, for a part of herself she hadn't acknowledged in years. The city lights of New York stretched far and wide, but for James they no longer held the same allure. He sat slumped at a corner table in a dimly lit bar, a nearly empty glass of whiskey in front of him. The days of lavish parties, extravagant dinners, and VIP treatment were long gone. Months had passed since Vanessa had walked out on him, leaving him to face the debts, lawsuits, and failed business ventures that were now consuming everything he had built. James rubbed his temples, trying to block out the harsh reality that had become his life. He had lost everything. The company he had once led with pride, the real estate empire that had made him a star in New York's business world, was gone. He had made bad deals and taken risky investments that didn't pay off. Vanessa, always the opportunist, had left the moment the money dried up. She hadn't even bothered with a proper goodbye, just packed her bags and disappeared. Deep down, James had seen it coming. The signs were there. Her growing disinterest, the late-night calls, the subtle hints she was looking for something else, someone else. But just like he had ignored Laura's calls when he left her behind on the farm, he had ignored the truth. The bartender, a middle-aged man who had seen his share of customers drowning their sorrows, approached with mild sympathy. "Need a refill?" he asked. "No, I'm good," James mumbled, though there was nothing remotely good about his situation. He stood from the bar and tossed a few crumpled bills on the counter, just enough to cover his tab. As he stepped out into the cold night air, it hit him like a slap in the face. The city around him buzzed with life, as it always did. But to James, it felt distant, like he no longer belonged. Just a year ago, he had been on top of the world, rich, admired, and with a beautiful woman by his side. But everything had been built on deception, lies, and a shallow pursuit of wealth. His empire, once a source of pride, had crumbled in mere months. His bank accounts were frozen, his properties seized, and his name dragged through the mud by the media. The final blow had come just weeks ago, when he was forced to sell the last of his assets. All that remained was his apartment, and even that was on borrowed time. Creditors were closing in, and soon he would have nothing left, not even the shattered remains of his reputation. As James wandered through the crowded streets, his thoughts drifted to the farm, to Laura and Jack. He hadn't thought about them in ages, but now, in the midst of his downfall, their faces lingered in his mind, haunting him. What had they done to deserve his abandonment? Laura had always been supportive, even when he decided to chase after Vanessa, leaving both her and Jack behind. And Jack. James couldn't even remember the last time he had seen his son. The boy had likely grown so much by now, but James had missed it all. Missed birthdays, milestones, everything that truly mattered. And for what? A life of luxury that had proven to be nothing but an empty illusion. Now, they were just reminders of what he had lost, of the hollow life he had chased at the cost of everything that had truly mattered. It was one of those high-end hotels he used to frequent, back when money meant nothing and life felt limitless. But now, the sight of it filled James with a deep sense of shame. Just the other day, he had applied for a job there, not as a guest, but as a janitor. James glanced through the glass doors, catching a glimpse of the marble floors and sparkling chandeliers. He had walked those same floors before, dressed in designer suits, brushing shoulders with the powerful and wealthy. Now, he was nothing more than a faded memory of the man he once was. The job interview had been nothing short of humiliating. He had sat in a small office, wearing clothes that didn't fit him quite right, scribbling out an application he never thought he'd have to fill out. The young hotel manager who interviewed him had studied him closely, unsure if a man like James could handle mopping floors and cleaning toilets. But James didn't have a choice anymore. He needed the job, needed the money. There was no other option. The manager had given him the position on the spot. The pay was next to nothing, but it was something. It would keep him going, at least for a little while. His first shift was tomorrow. Tomorrow he would start a new life. one he had never imagined for himself. James inhaled deeply, the cold air biting at his lungs. This was the result of his decisions, the women he pursued, the bad deals he made, and most of all, abandoning his family. Now, everything was catching up with him, and there was no running from it. The following morning, James arrived at the hotel for his first day on the job. The uniform they handed him felt stiff and unfamiliar, a far cry from the tailored suits he used to wear with pride. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the other staff as he grabbed the cleaning supplies and headed to start his shift. As James scrubbed the floors, the weight of his reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. This was his life now. No more glitzy parties, no more fancy dinners. Just him, a mop, and the haunting reminders of the mistakes that led him here. But, as overwhelming as it was, there was a small part of him that wondered if this could be the start of something different. Meanwhile, Laura sat at her piano, her fingers effortlessly dancing across the keys as music filled the room. The soft afternoon sunlight poured in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the small concert hall where she rehearsed. It had been years since she felt this alive, this in touch with the version of herself she thought she had lost. The melodies seemed to lift her above the burdens she had once carried, pulling her beyond the hardships of her past. She had come a long way since those difficult days on the farm, when James's abandonment had nearly broken her spirit. Now, instead of merely surviving, she was thriving. Her name had become well known in the local music scene, and invitations to play at various events and small concerts were pouring in. The community had embraced her talent, and each performance helped her reconnect with the passion that had once defined her life. Her success didn't happen overnight, but it had been steady, largely thanks to David. He had encouraged her every step of the way, constantly reminding her of the musical gift she had buried for so long. He had taken on more of the farm responsibilities, giving Laura the space and time she needed to focus on her music again. Jack, now in school, was also doing well. Their once lonely existence had transformed into a life filled with balance and happiness. After her rehearsal, Laura stepped down from the stage, taking a deep breath as she soaked in the sense of accomplishment. She had a performance later that evening, and anticipation bubbled within her. The most important thing was that she was doing what she loved, not for anyone else, but for herself, for Jack, and for David. David had become more than just a support. He had been the foundation she leaned on, helping her rediscover who she was meant to be. In the years since David had entered her life, he had become her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had built something truly special, a family, a home, and now, a future. It wasn't the life she had once imagined for herself, but in so many ways it was better than anything she could have dreamed. There was love, stability, and a shared sense of purpose that gave every day meaning. As Laura gathered her things to head home from rehearsal, she saw Jack in the hallway, holding David's hand as they walked toward her. Her heart swelled at the sight, a warm reminder of the life they had created together. Jack had grown so much, and he adored David, seeing him as a father figure. Their bond was something that filled Laura with gratitude every single day. "Mama!" Jack called out, his face lighting up with excitement as he ran toward her. "Are you ready for tonight? I told all my friends at school about your concert." Laura laughed, bending down to embrace him. "I'm ready, sweetheart, and I'm so glad you're excited," she replied. David smiled warmly as he approached, his eyes filled with pride. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, stepping closer to wrap his arm around Laura's shoulders. "You're going to be amazing." Laura leaned into him, soaking in the comfort of his presence. "Thanks to you," she said softly. "I don't know where." I'd be without you." David shook his head, his smile growing. "You've always had this in you, Laura. I just gave you a little nudge." It was true. David had believed in her when she struggled to believe in herself. He had been by her side, day after day, helping her rediscover the part of herself that had been lost for so long. And now, as she prepared for yet another performance, Laura felt more alive than she had in years. Later that evening, as the concert hall began to fill with the soft murmur of the audience, Laura stood backstage, her stomach fluttering with anticipation. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of all the work she had put in. It was her time, her moment to shine. Laura had worked tirelessly to reach this moment, and no matter what happened next, she had already won. She had reclaimed her music, her passion, and most importantly, her life. As the lights dimmed, the announcer's voice echoed through the concert hall, introducing her to the waiting audience. Stepping onto the stage, Laura's heart raced, her nerves bubbling up. But the second her fingers touched the piano keys, all of her anxiety melted away. The music took over, flowing through her with a grace that felt like coming home. The audience sat in silence, captivated by the beauty of her performance. With her eyes closed, Laura lost herself in the melody, knowing without a doubt that this was where she was meant to be. The years of struggle, the sacrifices she had made, they had all led to this. As she played the final notes, a wave of emotion washed over her. The moment she finished, the crowd erupted into applause, filling the hall with thunderous approval. Laura stood and bowed, her heart swelling with gratitude. In the front row, she spotted David and Jack, their faces glowing with pride. It was more than she could have ever hoped for. After the concert, as the audience trickled out and the stage hands began clearing the set, Laura found herself surrounded by well-wishers. People congratulated her, offering praise for the beauty of her performance and her obvious talent. It was humbling, and as she smiled and thanked them, Laura realized just how far she had come. But in the midst of all the compliments and admiration, it was David and Jack who mattered most. They were her family, the ones who had stood by her side through everything. David wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You were incredible," he whispered, his voice full of admiration. Laura smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered back, her words full of sincerity. Later that evening, as they drove back to the farm, Laura gazed out at the darkened fields, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in years. She had built a new life, one filled with love, music, and a future she had once thought impossible. And as they pulled into the driveway, Laura realized that for the first time in a long time, she was truly happy. James wiped the sweat from his brow as he pushed the mop across the hotel lobby floor. The once gleaming marble, now smudged with dirty footprints from guests bustling in and out. He despised this job. Every stroke of the mop was a cruel reminder of the life he had lost, his wealth, his power, his sense of significance. Now he was just another invisible face, unnoticed and forgotten. The opulence of the hotel mocked him. The glittering chandeliers above sparkled like a reflection of his former life, close enough to see but impossible to touch. Each day served as a bitter reminder of the choices that had led him here. He had traded his family for Vanessa, for the illusion of a better life, and it had all crumbled into dust. He hadn't heard from Laura in years, and he tried not to think about Jack, the son he had abandoned. Guilt gnawed at him constantly, but what good was it now? There was no undoing the past. All he could do was keep his head down and push through the day. The lobby was buzzing with activity, guests checking in, couples heading to dinner, families preparing for a night out in the city. James kept to himself, eyes downcast, blending into the background like a piece of furniture. His life had devolved into an endless routine of scrubbing floors, cleaning restrooms, and hauling out garbage. It was degrading, but it was all he had left. As he turned the corner, pushing his cleaning cart along, he glanced up and froze. His heart skipped a beat, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. At the far end of the lobby, standing tall and poised, was Laura. Time seemed to slow as James stared, unable to process what he was seeing. She looked older, yes, but the years had treated her well. She stood gracefully, holding the hand of a man who was most definitely not James. Next to them, a young boy stood, close in age to what Jack had been the last time James saw him. And then, James's eyes drifted to the young man beside them, tall, with striking features and a quiet air of confidence. His heart clenched painfully as he realized it was Jack. There they were, Laura, Jack, and the man James didn't know. The man who must have taken his place. The mop slipped from his hands, clattering to the floor, but he barely noticed. His mind spun, caught between disbelief and an overwhelming wave of regret. He had never thought he'd see them again, especially not like this, happy, thriving, without him. Laura hadn't spotted him at first, too engrossed in checking in at the front desk, laughing softly with Jack and the man at her side. But then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Their eyes met. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Recognition flashed across Laura's face, followed by surprise and something else. Pity, perhaps. James felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. The years of silence, the running, the guilt, they all caught up with him in that moment, crushing him beneath the weight of his own failures. Laura's gaze held his for a moment longer, but then she turned away, back to Jack and the man beside her. She didn't come over, didn't say a word. There was no confrontation, no drama. Instead, she resumed her conversation as if James was nothing more than a stranger passing through. But to James, it felt like a gut punch. He stood there, frozen, watching as they moved toward the elevators. Jack glanced back briefly, his eyes passing over James without a flicker of recognition. How could he recognize a man who'd abandoned him all those years ago? The elevator doors slid shut, and just like that, they were gone. James stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing, heart aching. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had imagined this reunion in 100 different ways, but never like this. Never this quiet, this distant. Never this final. Laura looked happy, happier than James had ever seen her when they were together. The man at her side, his arm wrapped protectively around her, clearly loved her. They had a family now, one that didn't include him. The pain hit harder than he had expected. He had always known Laura would move on, that she'd find someone better than him. But seeing it with his own eyes was another matter entirely. In that moment, James had never felt more alone, more worthless. A sharp voice abruptly interrupted his train of thought. "Hey! Are you going to finish cleaning or just stand there?" James blinked, turning to see the hotel manager glaring at him. Without saying a word, James picked up the mop and resumed his work, though his hands shook and his mind was miles away. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. He went through the motions, scrubbing floors, cleaning bathrooms, doing exactly what was expected of him. But inside, he was elsewhere, lost in thoughts of Laura, Jack, and the life he had willingly thrown away. He didn't know what to do next, or even if he should do anything at all. How could he possibly reach out after all this time, after the pain he had caused? As he clocked out and trudged back to his small, dingy apartment that night, the image of Laura and her new family haunted him. He had missed so much: Jack growing up, the life they had built without him. And now, seeing them happy and complete without him only magnified the emptiness inside. James knew there was no going back. The life he had destroyed could never be restored. But for the first time, a flicker of hope, or maybe desperation, crept in. Was there a chance, however small, for redemption? Could he, in some way, make things right, even if he could never truly be part of their lives again? That night, James barely slept. His mind raced with thoughts of Laura and Jack. He lay in the dark, staring up at the cracked ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong, and if it was too late to make amends. For years, James had pushed away any thoughts of his old life, burying them beneath layers of ambition and greed. But now, after seeing Laura and Jack so unexpectedly, it was all he could think about. By the time the sun started to rise, James had made up his mind. He needed to speak to Laura. He couldn't continue living with the regret, the guilt, and the endless what-ifs. He knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he had to try. The next day, James returned to the hotel, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't have the courage to ask anyone for Laura's room number, so he lingered in the lobby, pacing nervously near the elevators. Every time the doors slid open, he held his breath, hoping it would be her. Hours passed, and doubt began creeping in. What if she didn't want to see him? What if she had already left, taking her new life with her, leaving him behind once again? The thought twisted his stomach, but he refused to leave. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Finally, as the afternoon wore on, the elevator doors opened. And there she was. Laura stepped out, looking as radiant as ever, though the weight of their past hung between them like a cloud. She paused when she saw him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The tension between them felt suffocating. "Laura," James said at last, his voice shaky and low. "Can we talk?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched his, filled with a mix of surprise and caution. James could see the weariness there, the hesitation born from years of hurt. He knew she was thinking of all the pain he had caused her. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to talk to you." Laura let out a long, slow breath, and for the first time, her expression softened slightly. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's talk." They stepped out of the hotel, the crisp fall breeze brushing past their faces. They wandered over to a small bench in a quiet corner of the park, away from the city's noise. James sat down first, feeling the heavy weight of the moment settle on him. Laura joined him, but the space between them felt like a canyon. Neither said a word for what seemed like forever. James wrestled with his thoughts, unsure of how to even start. How could he explain himself? How could he possibly undo the damage he had caused? I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Laura, I'm so sorry for everything, for leaving you, for walking away from Jack. His voice faltered, and he swallowed hard. "I was selfish. I was scared." Laura remained silent for a while, her hands resting in her lap, listening as James let his emotions pour out. "I thought I wanted more," he continued, his voice shaky. "I thought the money, the success, all of it would make me happy. But it didn't. It destroyed everything. I lost everything. And now I look at you. You've made this amazing life without me. I don't blame you for moving on, for finding joy again. But I can't stop thinking about what I threw away. Laura finally spoke, her voice steady but firm. "James, it wasn't just about the money. You didn't leave just for that. You left because you wanted a completely different life. And that's okay. But you didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from Jack, too." James flinched at the mention of his son. That was the deepest cut, the one that still stung the most. He had abandoned Jack, left him without a father, all because of his own greed. "I know," he whispered. "I know I don't deserve his forgiveness, or yours, but I'm asking anyway. Not to forget what I did, but to at least forgive me." Laura's expression softened, her eyes reflecting a sorrow that mirrored his own. "James, I've spent years trying to come to terms with everything that happened. I've rebuilt my life. Jack has grown into an incredible young man, and David's been there for both of us." James nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I can see that. I saw you all together, and it's clear how happy you are. You deserve that, Laura. You deserve all the happiness in the world." Laura studied him for a moment, her gaze searching his. "I do forgive you, James," she said quietly, "but it's not for you, it's for me. Holding on to that pain and anger, it wasn't helping anyone. I'm in a different place now. I've built a new life. But that doesn't mean the hurt just disappears." Her words soothed his wounded spirit, though there was a bitter sweetness to them. She had truly moved on, and there was no longer any room for him in her world. He had known this deep down, but hearing it from her made it final. "I don't expect anything from you," James said, his voice raspy. "I just needed to apologize, and I wanted to know that you're okay, that you're happy." Laura nodded, a soft smile forming at the corner of her lips. "I am happy, James, and I hope you can find peace too." For a while, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. It was a strange kind of closure, full of both forgiveness and the finality of what could never be. James knew now that Laura's life would continue without him, just as it had all these years, and, though it hurt, he accepted it. "I should go," Laura said after a few moments, standing up. "Take care of yourself, James." James watched her walk away, her figure gradually shrinking as she headed back toward the hotel. He stayed on the bench long after she was gone, the cold air biting at his skin. He had come seeking forgiveness, and while he had found it, the emptiness inside him remained. As James stood up and began walking away, he realized there was still a long journey ahead of him. But for the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he had lost: hope. Laura, on the other hand, walked away from James with a heart full of mixed emotions, relief and sadness intertwined. As she neared the hotel lobby, she saw Jack sitting by a large window, laughing with David. The sight of them together, so easy, so natural, warmed her heart. Jack was happy, thriving in the life they had built. David had stepped in, not as a replacement for James, but as someone who filled the space James left behind. He had been there for Jack in ways that Laura could never fully express, and for that, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. When Jack spotted her, he jumped up, bounding toward her with that youthful energy only a young man like him could possess. "Mum, where did you go? We were waiting for you." Laura smiled, pulling him into a warm embrace. "I just needed some fresh air, sweetheart," Laura replied, giving Jack a reassuring smile before glancing over at David. He was watching her with that familiar knowing look. He could sense something had shifted, but he didn't pry. David always knew when to offer her space, without needing to ask. "You ready to head out?" David asked as he stood and stretched. "The concert hall's not far, but we don't want to be late." Laura nodded, smoothing a hand over Jack's hair. Yeah, let's go." As they strolled through the bustling city streets toward the concert hall, Laura felt lighter than she had in years. The conversation with James had brought a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Forgiving him wasn't easy, but it had been vital. Not just for him, but for her own peace of mind. Holding on to all that pain, that anger, had weighed her down for too long. David walked quietly beside her, his hand brushing against hers. She slid her fingers into his, feeling the warmth of his palm, and though he didn't say a word, his presence spoke volumes. He had always been enough. From the moment he entered her life, David had been that steady presence she hadn't known she needed. Jack was walking ahead of them, his excitement practically bubbling over with each step. "Mum, I can't wait to see you perform tonight. Do you think a lot of people will come?" Laura smiled at his enthusiasm. "I think so, sweetheart. It's going to be a great night." The concert hall appeared ahead, its bright lights cutting through the evening sky. As they stepped inside, Laura felt that familiar flutter of nerves she always got before performing. But this time, it wasn't fear, it was excitement. She was doing what she loved, and with her family by her side, nothing else mattered. Backstage, as she prepared for the performance, Laura found a quiet moment to herself. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman, looking back at her, seemed calm, confident, and sure of herself, a stark contrast to the person she had been years ago when James had left. Back then, she had been uncertain of how she'd move forward. But now, she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and discovered a strength she never knew she had. The sudden knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. It was one of the stagehands, letting her know it was almost time. Laura took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of her dress before heading toward the stage. As she stepped out into the blinding lights, the applause from the audience filled the room, a wave of energy that washed over her, steadying her nerves. She sat at the piano, her fingers lightly resting on the keys, and for a fleeting moment, her mind drifted to James. Lightly resting on the keys, and for a fleeting moment, her mind drifted to James. But this time, there was no bitterness, no resentment, only compassion. He had been part of her journey, a chapter in her story that had helped shape who she had become, but he no longer played the leading role. This moment was hers, her future, her happiness. The first notes of her performance reverberated through the hall, and Laura became immersed in the music. It was as if the outside world ceased to exist, leaving only her, the piano, and the audience. Every chord, every melody flowed from deep within her, carrying the weight of the past and the promise of the future. When the final note echoed through the room, the crowd erupted in applause. Laura stood, bowed, and felt her heart swell with pride and gratitude. She glanced toward the front row where David and Jack stood, clapping louder than anyone else. Her family, her home. After the concert, as people filtered out, congratulating her, Laura smiled. Not just because of the successful performance, but because of the peace she had finally found within herself. By forgiving James, she had freed herself from the chains of the past. Later, as they walked back to their hotel, Jack excitedly recounted his favorite parts of the concert, while David slipped his arm around Laura's waist. The night air was cool, but Laura felt warm, wrapped in the love of the people who mattered most. As they reached their room, Laura paused, savoring the quiet of the moment. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at David. "For what?" he asked, smiling. "For everything," she replied, leaning into him. "For helping me find my way back to myself." David kissed her forehead gently. "You did that all on your own, Laura. I was just lucky enough to be part of the journey." Laura smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She had come so far, and the future was full of possibilities. But now, with her family beside her, she knew she could face whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, the echo of Laura's words lingered with James long after their conversation ended. He had spent the night wandering aimlessly through the streets of New York, unsure of where to go or what to do next. The forgiveness he had sought from Laura had come, but it was bittersweet. It brought some relief, but it also highlighted how much he had lost. Yes, he had been forgiven, but he hadn't been welcomed back. There would be no reconciliation with the family he had walked away from. The years of absence could never be erased, and the reality was that there was no way for him to be part of their lives again. The closure Laura had given him was real, but it was also a stark reminder that his past was now sealed away, and he had no role in her future. By the time James finally reached his small, dim apartment, the first rays of the morning sun were peeking over the skyline. The apartment was a far cry from the lavish homes he had once known. The furniture was minimal, the walls were empty, and the silence seemed to fill every corner. This was what his greed and ambition had left him with. Once he had it all, a loving family, wealth, and a future brimming with potential. Now, all he had were memories of the life he had thrown away, and the regrets that haunted him. As he stood by the narrow window, gazing out over the city that had once felt like his playground, James couldn't help but reflect on the choices that had led him here. He had always believed that success was defined by how much money you made, how many people envied you, and how much control you had over everything. But all this time, he'd been running from it. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to really take stock of the person he'd become. He had spent so much time convinced that power and wealth were all that counted. In the end, though, they left him feeling empty and alone. The success he'd pursued had come at a steep price. The people he cared about, the most. The truth hit him like a wave crashing down. None of it had been worth it. Not the money, not the parties, not the status. He had given up everything truly meaningful for a shallow life of luxury, which fell apart the moment things got tough. James got to his feet, pacing around the small room. He had to take action. He couldn't just sit here, wallowing in regret. But what could he actually do? Laura had made it clear that their paths had split, and Jack probably didn't even remember him. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. He had to try. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make peace with it. The next day, James found himself outside a small cafe near Central Park, where Laura had once told him she liked to take Jack when they were in the city. It was a long shot, but he had no better plan. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome. In fact, he wasn't sure if Jack would even want to see him, but he had to try. As the hours slipped by, James sat at one of the outside tables, sipping on a coffee that had long gone cold. He watched the world pass by, families, couples, kids laughing and playing in the park. Each face reminded him of the life he'd let slip away, the family he'd lost. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he spotted them. Laura, David, Jack, and their younger child were heading toward the park, laughing and smiling together. James' chest tightened at the sight. They looked so happy, so complete. All this time he'd been avoiding it. For the first time in years, James let himself really think about the man he had become. He'd spent so many years chasing power and wealth, convinced those were the only things that mattered. But in the end, they had left him feeling hollow and isolated. The success he once craved had cost him the people he loved the most. The realization hit him like a crashing wave. None of it had been worth it. Not the money, not the parties, not the recognition. He had given up everything truly important for an empty life of luxury that collapsed the moment things got difficult. James got to his feet, pacing the small room. He had to act. He couldn't just sit here drowning in guilt. But what could he actually do? Laura had made it clear that their lives had gone in separate directions, and Jack probably didn't even remember him. Yet, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling inside. He had to try. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could try to make peace with it. The next day, James found himself outside a small cafe near Central Park, the one Laura had once mentioned she took Jack to when they visited the city. It was a long shot, but he had no other plan. He wasn't expecting a warm reception. In fact, he wasn't even sure if Jack would want to see him. But he had to try. As the hours dragged on, James sat at one of the outdoor tables, sipping on a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. He watched families, couples, and kids laughing as they played in the park. Each face reminded him of the life he had let slip away, the family he had lost. Finally, after what felt like forever, he saw them. Laura, David, Jack, and their younger child were heading toward the park, laughing and smiling together. James felt his heart tighten. They looked so happy, so complete. He knew he didn't belong there, but something deep inside pushed him to stand up, to at least try. Laura was the first to notice him. She paused briefly, her eyes narrowing just a bit, but then she gave a small nod in his direction. It wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was her way of allowing him to be there, even though he was no longer part of their lives. Jack looked over at him, his expression impossible to read. James's heart ached as he watched his son, now almost grown, walk by without saying a word. But this time, it didn't crush him. This time, he understood. Jack didn't owe him anything. His son had built a life without him, and James had to come to terms with that. But as Laura and her family continued on, something shifted inside James. He couldn't change the past, but he could start by accepting what had come of it. He had asked for forgiveness, and now he needed to forgive himself, not for leaving, but for the years spent running from the truth. James stayed at the cafe long after they'd left, his thoughts settling over him like a gentle rain. He wasn't the same man anymore, and maybe that was the most important realization. He had to change, and redemption wasn't about some grand gesture, but about taking small steps. As he stood and walked toward the park, the city buzzing with life all around him, James felt something unfamiliar stir within him. Hope. In the following weeks, James found himself reflecting more and more on that moment with Laura and Jack. The pain of seeing them happy without him was still there, but it had also sparked something inside, a need to change, to rebuild from the ruins of his past mistakes. He understood now that redemption wouldn't be quick or easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face the future instead of running from it. He poured himself into his job at the hotel, no longer seeing it as a form of punishment, but as an opportunity to prove to himself that he could be more than just the man who lost it all. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was reliable, and James began to find a sense of calm in the daily routine. Every day, he worked quietly and with care. Though most of the other employees barely noticed him, James took a quiet pride in doing his job well. It wasn't just about collecting a paycheck anymore. It was about rebuilding his sense of self-worth. For too long, James had measured his value by how much money he had or what people thought of him. But now he was learning that true worth came from within. He had spent years chasing after approval from others, but now he realized the only person he needed to prove anything to was himself. One day, after finishing his shift and leaving the hotel, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The weight of his past was still there, But it no longer suffocated him. He had accepted that he couldn't undo the past, and now he was focused on moving forward, however slowly that might be. Walking through the streets of New York, he found himself heading towards Central Park, a place that had become something of a sanctuary for him in recent weeks. The park was full of life, with families picnicking, kids playing, and people jogging along the paths. It was a constant reminder that life carried on, even as he worked to rebuild his own. When he reached a quiet bench near the edge of the park, James sat down, watching the people pass by. His mind wandered to Laura, to Jack, and to the life he had lost. But instead of being weighed down by regret or bitterness, he felt a sense of peace. They had moved on, and so had he. Laura had forgiven him, and now it was time for him to forgive himself. Lost in his thoughts, he barely noticed when someone approached. It wasn't until the familiar sound of footsteps stopped right in front of him that James looked up, his heart skipping a beat. It was Jack. The young man stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression cautious but not cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with their shared history. James's heart raced in his chest. He had envisioned this moment countless times, but now that it was happening, James found himself speechless. "Hi, Dad," Jack said, his voice steady but tinged with hesitation. James swallowed hard, the word Dad hitting him like a wave. He hadn't heard Jack call him that in so many years. Hearing it now, after everything, felt like both a precious gift and a painful reminder of all the lost time between them. "Hi, Jack," James replied, his voice raspy with emotion. Jack looked down at the ground, as though collecting his thoughts, before lifting his eyes to meet his father's. "I saw you at the cafe the other day. I didn't know if I should say anything, but I guess I just wanted to see if you were okay." James felt a lump form in his throat. Of all the things he'd imagined, this was not one of them. He had convinced himself that Jack wouldn't want anything to do with him, that the gap between them was too wide to close. And yet, here, Jack was standing before him, offering something James had never dared to hope for, a chance. I'm trying to be," James whispered. "I know I wasn't there for you, Jack, and I can never make up for that. But I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything." Jack nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I spent a long time being angry at you," he said, his tone deliberate. "You left, and for a long time I didn't understand why. I guess I still don't. Not completely." James opened his mouth to explain, but Jack raised a hand, gently stopping him. "I'm not asking you to explain it," Jack continued. "I've already made peace with it. I don't want to carry that anger anymore. I've seen how happy Mom is now, with David, with the life we've built. And I guess I realized holding on to that anger wasn't helping anyone, least of all me." Emotions surged inside James. He wanted to reach out, to tell Jack how deeply he regretted every single moment he had missed, but he knew that words alone would never be enough. All he could do was listen, hoping that somehow they could find a path forward. "I don't expect anything from you," Jack added, his voice softening. "But I wanted you to know that I'm not angry anymore. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." James nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Jack. That means more to me than you'll ever know." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. James longed to ask Jack about his life, to find some way to reconnect. But he knew this was a fragile moment. He didn't want to push too hard or risk losing the delicate connection they had just begun to rebuild. After what felt like an eternity, Jack finally spoke again. "I'm meeting up with Mum and David soon," he said, glancing toward the park. "But maybe we can talk sometime. You know, catch up." James's heart soared at the suggestion. It wasn't much, but it was something. A glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to rebuild the relationship he had lost with his son. "I'd like that," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd really like that." Jack gave him a small smile, a gesture that felt like a lifeline amid the storm that had been James's life. With a nod, Jack turned and headed toward the park, leaving James standing there, watching him go. As Jack disappeared into the crowd, a sense of peace settled over James. He had been given a second chance, not just with Jack, but with himself. It wasn't much, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was enough. For the first time in years, James felt like he could truly breathe again. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Step by step, moment by moment, he would rebuild his life, not defined by the mistakes of his past, but by the hope of what still could be. As he walked away from the park, the city lights twinkling in the distance, James smiled. It wasn't over. Not yet.